One of the things about our show is it's going to be unique.
You are what you do. You can say any amount of things that you want to say, but what you do is what everybody sees.
People are like, oh, I'm just going to JV it. Like, let's just JV it. Like, what the hell does that mean?
I cannot tell you how excited I am to hang out with you guys today, so thank you so much.
Well, then that end buyer could come back and say, well, I didn't fully understand that it was subject to.
That's not a thing. Like, the SEC has thought of all of these things. They've been here since 1932.
And you can do what you want with your property.
Buyers have time, they have negotiating power, they have options.
Oh my gosh, I am blown away by your inexperience, and they've been in business 20 years.
And that includes things other people put on your property, right? It's your property to be okay. Suddenly Cousin Jimmy's in a lawsuit.
A novation is replacing one contract or one obligation with another.
Out with the old, in with the new.
Yes.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to the show. Today, our topic is the ins and outs of doing or starting a podcast. I'm Andy Fowler, and I'm here with Sean St. Clair. If you're new to the show, make sure to give us a like. You can find us on Facebook, YouTube, X, formerly known as Twitter. On each of those handles, you can find us at the handle at In Rem Podcast. That's at In Rem Podcast. Also, you can go to Spotify or you can go to Apple Podcasts or any other audio podcast platform and download an audio version of the podcast. It's free. You can listen to it on the go. Go there, leave us a review. We'd really appreciate it. It helps us out a ton. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Sean, who has our legal update.
Thank you, Andy. So my legal update today is talking about a law that was recently passed in Wisconsin that governs real estate wholesalers. So as most of you know, I'm licensed to practice law in both Arizona and Wisconsin. And when we first started this show about 2 years ago now, I think, one of our first show topics was a law that was passed in Arizona requiring that real estate wholesalers make certain disclosures to sellers and assignees within their documents. Well, Wisconsin recently has passed a very similar law. So I'm almost having kind of a deja vu moment here of going through this Wisconsin law, because it really is very similar to Arizona's. It's not identical, but it's similar. The Wisconsin law went in effect in March of this year. So every wholesaler here in Wisconsin who is going to be entering into contracts with owners of residential property must have certain language in their purchase agreement. So let's break down this new law a little bit. So basically, the law applies to real estate wholesalers who intend to assign their rights under a purchase agreement for residential property to a third party. Well, the definition of a wholesaler is somebody who intends to or will assign their rights. And so if you're a wholesaler, if your intention is to assign your purchase agreement for residential property to a third party, you have to make disclosures under this law. So what is residential property? This is a little bit of a difference, I believe, between the Arizona and Wisconsin law. Wisconsin goes up to 4 dwelling units. So a fourplex qualifies as a residential property here in Wisconsin. So a property that contains either 1 and up to 4 dwelling units will qualify as a residential property. Additionally, a purchase agreement includes basically any type of interest that an investor is taking in a property. So that includes a executory contract or a purchase agreement, a lease. So if the investor is going to enter into a lease and they intend to assign that lease, then that would qualify as a purchase agreement that requires certain disclosures. An option to purchase, which again would require the disclosures. So basically, if there's any chance that an investor is going to enter into any type of purchase contract or purchase agreement, a lease, an option, and they're going to assign their interests under those documents, then they have to have these required disclosures. So what are the required disclosures? Basically, the required disclosures provide that the buyer, the wholesale buyer, must disclose to the seller that they are a real property wholesaler. That's the language. The buyer must disclose that they're the real property wholesaler. They can also take it a step further and say, buyer is a real property wholesaler who intends to assign their interest under this contract or agreement to a third party. That way, the seller, is even further informed of what it means to be a real property wholesaler. While the statute only requires the disclosure of a real property wholesaler, in my view, that doesn't really tell the seller anything if the seller is unfamiliar with what that term means. In the investment community, we understand what that means, but a seller may not understand that. So I recommend taking it a step further and just saying buyer is a real estate property wholesaler who intends to assign their interest in this contract to a third party. The second thing that must be disclosed is the fact that the wholesaler who is now under contract with the seller does not have actual title to the property, and that must be disclosed to a third-party assignee of the purchase agreement. So basically, they have to disclose before entering, either at the time or before entering into the assignment, they must disclose to the assignee that the real property wholesaler's rights as buyer under a purchase agreement strike that. Basically, they have to disclose to the assignee that the assignor is a real property wholesaler. So there it is, that language again. So the assignor is a real property wholesaler that holds an equitable interest in the residential real property as a buyer under the purchase agreement, and that the assigner is conveying the assigner's interest in the purchase agreement and not title to the residential real property. So basically, they have to say, hey, look, I'm a real estate wholesaler. I am not on title to this, and I'm only assigning the purchase agreement. I don't have the ability to convey title. And basically, so the assignee fully understands or appreciates that, the closing is conditioned upon the seller actually performing under the purchase agreement. So, the buyer, the assignor, can't unilaterally perform. It's going to require some type of cooperation or performance by the seller in order for the assignee / end buyer to end up with title to the property. So what are the penalties for not complying with the statute? So very similar to Arizona. If the disclosure is not timely made to the seller, then the seller at any time before closing may cancel the purchase agreement and retain any deposits, any earnest money. If the disclosure is not timely made to an assignee, the assignee at any time before closing can rescind the assignment and receive a return of their deposit or any other amounts that they've paid. So basically, the penalties for not disclosing are that the seller has a right to cancel and retain the deposit, and the assignee has a right to cancel the assignment and receive a return of any deposits or other amounts paid. However, the statute does make clear that the seller and the assignee cannot waive their rights to this disclosure language. So if you realize, oh, shoot, I didn't disclose, you can't say, oh, well, here, sign a waiver of your rights. You can't do any of that. They can't waive their rights prior to closing. However, it does explain that if the transaction closes, if escrow closes, then the right to rescind is terminated. So it's a done deal. There's no going back, a day after, a week after, 6 months after closing and saying, oh, you'd never disclosed to me that you were a real estate wholesaler. And now I want out of this transaction. No, if it closes, it closes, and there's no further rights of rescission. That's the statute. Those are the penalties. I think there's a little bit of confusion out there as far as, and I've seen some videos and heard some, non-attorneys out there in the space who have said, well, it's in Wisconsin, it's a crime with a $5,000 fine and punishable by potentially up to 6 months in jail. That's not accurate. That results from a wrong reading of the legislation. So there were, as with most legislation, this was just, a tack on part of the overall legislation that dealt with real estate licensing laws and brokers and disclosures to be made by brokers of, problems with the property and that type of thing. And basically within that, they did amend the criminal penalties for engaging in the unlicensed practice of acting as a real estate broker in Wisconsin. And so they did change that from $1,000 fine to a $5,000 fine, but they left the potential 6 months in jail in place. And while it's there in the Senate bill, it's in two separate sections and is not part of the real estate wholesaler provision. So the real estate wholesaler disclosure provisions only have two penalties or main penalties, which is rescission by either the seller or the assignee if the disclosure is not made.
Sean, when Arizona passed its wholesale disclosure law, we thought at the time that if there was any area within real estate law that we would see regulatory bodies focus in on more regulations, that it would be in the area of wholesaling. Now, I don't know if we've seen those regulations manifest as fast as maybe we thought that they would, maybe because there's been some slowdown in the real estate market generally. But I think what's happening is true, and Wisconsin is an example of that a lot of the regulatory focus has been, and probably I think will continue to be focused on wholesaling. And it certainly was the case in Wisconsin, and we'll see what we see in other states.
Yeah. In fact, a couple months back, I talked about Virginia passing a law that now requires wholesalers to be licensed as agents. And, you're limited. You can do, I think it's 1 or 2 transactions a year without having a license, but now they want, wholesalers to be licensed. So I think you're right. Slowly but surely, we're going to start seeing legislation that deals with wholesaling in particular. And who knows what other investment activities might become regulated, but it is a growing trend, and I think it will continue.
All right. With that, let's talk about an announcement. Every Tuesday at 2:00 p.m., we have the Creative Finance Collective. Creative Finance Collective, if you haven't attended, is a collection of lawyers and professionals in the space of creative finance from every state that we can find them. And we've had lawyers participating from Arizona, Texas, Wisconsin, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, California. We try to find them in as many places as we can get them, in Ohio, in Colorado. But there's really kind of a niche group of them. There's not a lot of attorneys in the creative finance space. Frankly, there's not a lot of attorneys who are even familiar with what the creative finance space is. So it's important to nail those down and to talk with those people. So the Creative Finance Collective is our opportunity to get together, talk with lawyers in the space, see what they're doing in other jurisdictions, see what other jurisdictions are doing in terms of passing laws, in terms of regulating the creative finance space. So we know what really the best practices are and how to better our own practice. But what we also do is make ourselves available for an entire hour to you, the listener, for questions. And we'll be on for as long as you have questions. If there are no questions, we just shut her down. So if you're there and you have questions and you want to be a part of it, and you've wondered maybe what creative finance might look like for you as a real estate investor, this is your time to engage with not just us, but multiple lawyers in this space to work through creative finance problems, questions, so on and so forth. So make sure to be there with us. Again, it's 2:00 every Tuesday, 2:00 Arizona time. So you want to adjust that if you're in another state. We've tried to adjust that here in Arizona time, even though we don't have daylight savings, adjusted here. So it's a little bit earlier in the evening or late afternoon for other states. So 2:00 p.m., the Creative Finance Collective. Make sure to join us. YouTube, Facebook, and X, formerly known as Twitter. All right, so let's get into our topic today. topic's a little bit different of a topic. We thought it might be a fun one. So the In Rem Podcast is a podcast for real estate investors. Sean and I are attorneys. We're real estate attorneys. And that's what we like to talk about. That's what we know. We represent clients in the field of real estate investing and real estate law. So that's really our business. So it's comfortable for us to talk about that. That's what this show is. But we thought might be a nice change and turn a little bit in discussion of the podcast is just to talk about why we decided to do a podcast and what we learned along the way and how we might be able to help you as you consider whether this might be something you have an interest in. Now, full disclosure and obvious reasons, it's not like we're some big name podcast that's got millions or tens of thousands or even thousands of listeners. We have a humble little community that we're super appreciative of. But whether you are a small podcast or a giant one, there are steps, there are barriers to entry that you have to go through and be aware of as you plan to try to decide whether this is something that makes sense for you and your business and something that you want to do going forward. So in getting into this, we'll walk through what we found, what works, what doesn't work, and what it takes to start. But we thought we'd just talk about just briefly why we decided to do a podcast. Sean, what the heck were we thinking? Why did we decide to do this?
Every Tuesday,
still trying to figure that out.
Every Tuesday morning, as I'm preparing, I'm like, why did we do this now? I think we had talked about it for a while. We had kind of messed around with, the idea of doing it. But I think one of the things that I think it's twofold. Number one, we saw, in my view, a little bit of a missing link in what was being pushed out there to real estate investors as far as, what the law provides, how transactions, are to be properly structured from the legal side of things, different legal topics out there within the community, and frankly, even some misinformation that we wanted to, try our best to kind of clarify and address. And so we saw a need within the community. So that was number one. And then the second thing that I think was a driving factor for us is just the idea of content. Anytime you're talking about social media, websites, things like that, a professional practice where you're trying to do some level of online marketing. Our firm for a long time didn't have any type of marketing director. Now we do. And in that process, we're like, she needed content, our firm needed content, we needed content personally for our own brands. And so by having a weekly podcast where we have to create topics, we have to bring on guests, we have to have discussions, I do a legal update, all of that just naturally creates content. And frankly, I said, facetiously, on Tuesday mornings, like, oh boy, what am I doing? Actually, it's not that much work. We have a very regimented schedule on how we go through and prepare and plan, which helps. But at the end of the day, we've created a lot of content and it hasn't been that significant of a time commitment or effort to do it.
Yeah. And I think a big part of it, like you said, is just engaging with the community where they're at. And a lot of the community with regard to maybe YouTube or video podcasting or just general podcasting is, how to go make money, how you can go make a ton of money and everything else. And some of that's accurate, some of it's not accurate. But like it or not, some of the most important things in life are some of the most boring things and sometimes the most expensive things. And when you're talking about lawyers, sometimes that's a difficulty. And obviously we charge for our time as attorneys, but what we wanted to do is really talk about what folks were doing in a collaborative way and talk about, if folks are going to do this, what's the best way to be thinking about this? Because at the end of the day, this is what we enjoy doing. And we thought that it would bring value. So we've enjoyed it to that point. So let's talk about a few things that you ought to think about before your first episode, things we had to go through. theme of a podcast and the name, right? We're talking about basic stuff here. But I think what it boils down to, and use us as an example, I mean, you could approach this a couple different ways. What's going to trend the fastest on a social media channel or whatever else? That's one way to do it. That's not the way we did it. Because Sean and I are real estate attorneys. Not everybody in the world is looking to go hear about real estate or the law of real estate, but some are. And for those that want to hear that and learn, that's who we're for. So for us, it was pretty easy. This is what we do. This is what we have an interest in. This is what we know. This is what is easiest for us to talk about. And I think if I would say anything to recommend, if you're considering a podcast, is focus on what you like. Focus on what you're good at. Focus on what you have a passion about. Otherwise, it's really hard to do well at it if you lack that passion or interest and knowledge for what it is. Sean, would you have anything to add to that?
No, definitely. I mean, I think you need to figure out, what do you enjoy and, make that available to the world. I mean, for us, we enjoy the practice of law. I do. I enjoy the practice of law. I enjoy thinking about, legal topics, legal theories, putting pieces of the puzzle together from a legal perspective for, transactions, things like that. But yeah, you really need to figure out what do I enjoy? I mean, my daughter, she watches all kinds of YouTube stuff, and she sits there and watches people clean their house. And I'm like, who is this person? And she's like, oh, it's so-and-so. And I'm like, how many followers do they have? They have like 1 million followers. And all literally this person does is go around and clean her house and describe how she's cleaning her house. And, there's other people who do cooking shows and things like that. And it's like, oh, wow. If you are passionate about what you do, and you're willing to put in the effort and push content and information out there, it's going to be a successful venture for you.
Yeah, I think the takeaway here is don't overthink it. I think so many people decide not to do it because they're like, I got to have the most brilliant idea ever. Just do what you like. And there's an audience out there that want to hear about it. I think this is an important one though, frequency. Right? How often are you going to do the show? How often should you consider doing that? I know there's a number of ways to slice this. There's a number of different levels of frequency. It could be daily. It could be weekly, bi-weekly, monthly. It could be completely at random, right? How do you choose what you're going to do? Well, for us, it was pretty easy. It was kind of what our calendars allowed, what our practices allowed. If we were a full-scale media company and that's all we did, it would be daily.
Right.
Because at the end of the day, the more content you can provide, the more your face is out there, the better. For us, it was weekly. I think in talking, Sean, I know you had been a guest on a number of podcasts and talking with other hosts. One of the important factors was that whatever it was done consistently, right?
Yeah, that seems to be kind of the make or break is, doing it on a regular basis so if you're going to do live or recorded, that the live is the same date and time every week. If you're going to do recorded, that you basically drop that recording in the same day and time every week or every month or, every other week. My personal opinion is that for you to really produce any type of level of content and to really get traction, it either needs to be daily or weekly. I think if you start doing bi-weekly or monthly, I think it becomes more hit or miss. I mean, the collective is a prime example of that. I had the idea to do like the Creative Finance Symposium, which was kind of similar to the way the collective is now, but we were doing it bi-weekly and it was just you and I, maybe a guest here or there. But it really didn't get any traction doing it that way. And then we tried to change the times and it still didn't get any traction. And then finally we rebranded it, called it the Collective, the Creative Finance Collective. We set a date and time, and it started to get traction. And then we still messed with the date and time. And now I think we've locked in this date and time, and now it really has traction. I mean, frankly, the whole show, we're answering questions. Before, it would be kind of hit or miss, whether or not we even got one question during the episode, the show. Now, I mean, we rarely have time to talk amongst each other. We're busy, answering questions and going through the questions that are popping up from the audience members, but we do it weekly now. It's at a set time. And people know, hey, this is when they're going to be on. This is when they're going to be available. This is when they're going to be answering the questions. And we have regular people who basically tune in, every week to watch and ask us, these questions regarding creative finance and real estate. So I think it's really important to be regular, or to be regularly scheduled, to have a regular time and day of the week. And I do think weekly is better than trying to do biweekly or monthly. If you're like, oh, well, I'm going to drop a podcast, and then maybe 2.5 months later, you drop another one. And then 5 months later, you drop another one. Yeah, that's cool. And you're getting some content out there. But at the end of the day, I'm not sure that you're really going to get any traction for, what you're with viewers and listeners and things like that.
I think rhythm is an important thing for you too, the creator. You need to be within a rhythm, and anything beyond a week is really hard to do. And that's even if you're working by yourself, you need that. But if you're working like together, like Sean and I are, 2 different lawyers in 2 locations some of the time, with 2 practice areas, servicing different clients at different times, busy and full calendars, you really need a rhythm that you can get in. And outside of a week, boy, I don't know how. I think it would be really difficult to establish kind of that rhythm that you're always doing and know what comes next in the next day. Let's talk about format, audio or video. I mean, that's another big thing that you're going to need to decide. With the decision, obviously, will include a good bit more equipment if you decide to incorporate video in addition to audio. Now, the nice thing I think with going all in with video is you also get audio. So you can do video, but there's also an audio recording of what you're doing with video, so you can have an audio version of a podcast as well. So when you commit to video, you kind of get everything. But understandably, there's going to be an equipment leap that you're going to have to consider when you go into video, recording equipment, camera equipment, so on and so forth. I think some of what dictates this is what platform do you want to be on? What's your audience? Where are they? And that's a hard question to answer because a lot of them are on a lot of these places, and you want to make it available to the largest reach of folks that can possibly have it. But I think the biggest decision that you want to consider when going audio versus video and audio is whether you want to make the leap into added equipment. Would you have anything else to add, Sean, on that?
Yeah. So for us, or for me, video podcasts are preferable for just watching purposes. So I'm not a big download a podcast, pop it in, listen to it, in your car type of person. I mean, I'm going to listen the first couple of minutes and then my mind's going to go off to whatever. And then like 15 minutes later, I'm like, what are they talking about? Versus when I watch podcasts, I like to just watch them video, either on my phone, on my TV, computer. And the video keeps me there and focused. I don't know why, but that's just the way I, operate. I can sit there and watch apparently TV and take it all in and not be distracted or whatever. And the same with the video, versus audio. I've just never liked. But here's the thing. Not only do you need additional equipment, but there's major issues with video with your guests. And we've had plenty of episodes and shows ruined because our guests couldn't get their cameras working, or their background was terrible, or, other issues where
Or their internet was garbage.
their internet was garbage, and
or our internet was garbage.
we've had that too. We're to blame on a few of those, but we've had plenty of episodes that were, problematic and a lot of frustration at times over the video versus if it was just audio and they were joining us, through the audio, it probably would have been just fine for most of those. But when we added in that video, and it just sometimes, it doesn't always work out very well. So that's another thing to think about when you're doing video is your quality may not be as good as you would normally like it if you do video, because you can't really control what happens with your guests and their technology.
Yeah. Another big consideration is live versus recorded. It didn't take us very long to think about this one. And I think we're glad we chose the one that we did, which was basically live. You can create a highly curated and edited video and spend a ton of time video editing it and upload that on a regular basis. That's one way to do it. Or you can just shoot the thing live with all of its perfections, so on and so forth. Sean and I are not video editors, professional technicians. We don't, have a giant media company to be able to hire, tons and tons of video editors, so we just thought, look, we're here to provide as best we can good content for those that are interested, and let's just do it live. And folks always have the opportunity to do it and watch after the fact. But for us, we wanted an hour set aside where we knew we were going to show up, we record, it was done, and we could move on to the next thing. And so you want to plan for some of that. Sean, I think I know the answer to this question, but I don't think you regret keeping it live and doing it live.
No, there's really two factors. Number one, live creates more pressure on you to try to get it right the first time. The second thing is, I'm a perfectionist. And so if we were doing the recordings and I said something wrong, I'd be like, oh, stop that. Let's do a retake on that. Right. We'd be doing that forever. And it would take, much longer to just record an episode. Even today, I ended up reading the wrong thing on my legal update on my notes. Well, I'm live. I can't do anything about it. If we were recorded, I would have been like, okay, let's stop there. Let's do, pick it up on a whatever. And I'd reread it and the whole thing. Now with live, hey, mistakes are going to happen. That's just part of it. But for us, having that pressure, having that to be on, and just knowing, hey, mistakes are going to happen. We're just going to keep going because it's live. And I think the audience also gives us a certain level of grace when it's live, as far as like, hey, yeah, we get it. And so we don't feel the need to go and edit things out and change things on videos and whatnot. We can just basically upload the video and just, what we produce is what we produce. And that's it. Now we do some editing with, shorts and reels and things like that. But as far as the actual show, I believe for the most part, we just download it and throw it up on, the podcast servers.
Moving on now, kind of talking about the next step to consider, and you kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier, but guest appearances and dealing with some of the hiccups that come with guest appearances. And the question here is, do you try to force in-person guest appearances or do them remote? As a practical matter, I think the answer to this is like, unless you are the Joe Rogan podcast with tens of millions of watchers and viewers, you can't really command people to come down to your location unless they're local or something like that. But there's a lot of great minds and voices all over the country in your particular field. So you really need to be prepared and ready for remote guest appearances. And like Sean said, you're going to need to be prepared ahead of time for some of the hiccups. It would be great to control the video and the audio quality at your own studio, assuming you've done all of that. But in reality, that I think that's really hard to expect unless you reach kind of the critical mass of viewership to where you can command it.
Yeah, I completely agree. the video quality is always better when our guests come into our office, where we have our studio, and then we even have another room that we utilize that has, really good lighting and background and good quality camera and mics and stuff like that. So that's great. But if we want to have a local Arizona podcast focusing on Arizona only issues, and our guests are always going to be, Arizona folks, then for the most part, I would try to get, the Phoenix guests to come into the office. I would probably push for that. But we didn't want that, right? We wanted to be more on a national level. We wanted to push to more markets than just the Arizona market. And because of that, we had to accept the fact that, some of our guests we've had guests from all over, California, Texas, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, you name it. I mean, we've had them, Wisconsin, and you couldn't do that you could, but there's a certain level of expense, like if they didn't want to pay for it, we would have to pay for them to come and that type of thing. And like you said, we're not a Joe Rogan podcast where you can basically say, hey, if you want to be on, get yourself here, type of thing. And so I think remote video appearances is fine. And 85% of the time it's been fine. The, technology backgrounds, audio, video have been fine. That other 15%, yeah, it stinks, but what can you do?
What about location of the hosts?
Yeah.
We talk about location of guests, but we're an example of you don't always have to be in the same location to do a podcast, right? In fact, anymore, we're rarely in the same location, right?
Yeah. So, and I do think it was important when we first started, you and I were in the same room. Our office has a virtual courtroom / studio, a recording studio, podcast studio set up. You're there right now. You and I first started there and we were together. And I think that was important for us to get back to your word rhythm, to get in a rhythm with each other. Because when you're in person, there's kind of you can play off of each other. You can see each other's, body language better, facial expressions better. There were times where I would even under the camera point to you to say you're next, make sure you have a question ready, cause I'm out, and, we could do those kind of things and nobody would know. And I think that was important. But once we did eventually, have that rhythm, I started traveling with my family, and had that opportunity. And now I'm in Wisconsin. And so there's, we just made it work. And I'm happy to talk about what I've done. Basically from middle of March of 2023 to, November of 2023, I was outside of Arizona, and much of that was spent in hotels and different places throughout the country that my family was traveling and visiting. And I shot this show in all kinds of locations, primarily hotel rooms. But, I had a whole bag and screen and everything that I was trucking in with me to hotels. Every time we arrived at a new hotel, I'm pulling all my stuff out because it's expensive equipment. So I didn't want to leave it in the car. And I'm having to do that. I'm having to do the setup, takedown in, hotels. I've had to, use different, the ice buckets and different things to set things on to make it all work. But I did. There were times where I got it wrong. And Rodlin, who produces the show, would say, try to do this better next time. And so I got to figure out how I'm going to get the camera further away from me or whatever. But I say all that to say, if you have two hosts, you should try to start for at least the first 6 months, if not a year, to be together in the same room, in the same location, so that you can have that rhythm established so that if one host does want to, start doing it remotely, they can, and you're comfortable enough with each other and kind of what you're looking for as far as, cues of who's next, who's up, that type of thing.
So we can talk more about some of the equipment as it compares to a studio setup versus what happens when you go to another host being remote, because that also changes kind of your equipment setup. But here's some obvious things that you need to think about if you haven't done it. And I guarantee you, unless you are just a producer or some sort of tech expert, there's so many facets of this that you don't really think about when either recording a podcast, and especially recording a video. But we're talking about cameras. You need good quality camera equipment with good quality lenses, and you might need multiple cameras depending on if you've got two hosts or if you want to have a guest, so on and so forth. Placement of those cameras within whatever room that you're doing. Cameras are obviously a big part of that. Microphones, audio equipment, sound is so important, and there's a lot of different ways to go about that, whether you are going to use XLR type microphones, which we use, or you're going to use digital microphones because you're doing it maybe directly from your desk and in a computer. There's advantages and disadvantages to quality, to cost, as to each one of those. Monitors, TV monitors. So one of the things that we were doing, which made this process a little bit easier for us, is our law firm was designing and constructing a virtual courtroom. Coming out of COVID, a lot of court appearances became virtual. And we said, well, if court appearances for the better part of forever are now going to be virtual, we need to up our virtual game. So we don't just look like slouches in a chair appearing before a judge. We wanted to look better than that. So basically, we prepared and constructed a digital courtroom, and which also dubbed as a podcast studio. So we went all in a lot of areas, probably areas that you don't necessarily need to do if you're just starting, but audio and microphones were a big part of that. Also, in addition to microphones, when you're thinking about sound and audio, is how sound bounces off walls. So sound paneling and all of those kind of things, are things that you can be thinking about in order to improve the quality of the sound in your equipment as you record. Monitors on the wall, TVs to be able to see what you're doing. Lighting, boy, lighting's a big one. Nobody ever thinks about lighting until you're there. And even when you try to do it in some minimal version, this angle creates this shadow or this or that. And I'm not going to look up and count all the different lights that are here, but there's a lot of lights that we use for this studio, and even for our kind of remote appearances. Lighting's a really big part of that. Now, it doesn't have to be a big expensive part of it, but that's a huge one. Then in addition to that, how are you going to control the cameras? How are you going to control the sound? Soundboards. Switchers that switch, which camera's hitting what, who's going to run that kind of stuff. What am I missing, Sean? What am I forgetting?
Well, when we were together in the studio, we needed to be able to, if our guest was on one screen and you and I were on the other, we needed to switch cameras back and forth within the studio so that you would have the shot if you were asking questions, and then that could switch over to me. And then there was a shot where you and I were together at the table for the intro and outro shots. And you have to be able to, at the time, we didn't have somebody behind the scenes like we do now who's playing with the cameras and switching them back and forth for us. Instead, I was having to think about that side of it. And I had a Stream Deck that I used, and, I basically was able to memorize the different cameras. Every once in a while I get it wrong, but for the most part, I would know the cameras. And then when you would start asking questions, boom, I would hit the button and that would switch the camera to you. And if I wanted to go back, and that was part of reading the cues too. You could see, I think where my finger was, which is I'm about to jump in, and so then you would, I would hit mine and jump in, and then we could, both be on together and that type of thing. So we, in our studio, we have 4 different cameras. We only use 3 for the show generally. But we had to be able to basically, quickly switch between cameras, and it was called a stream deck. And it worked great. It does take some programming. And if you don't know what you're doing on that, it's going to be a problem. In fact, there were times where in the morning we would show up and somehow the programming got messed up, and a level of panic would set in, but we normally figured it out. But nevertheless, so it's called a stream deck, and it basically allows you to do a lot of things, but we used it primarily for switching cameras back and forth during the show.
Now, a lot of that tech or equipment, not in total, but kind of gets a little bit thrown out the window when you decide to do hosts in a remote location. So all those cameras that you just mentioned aren't being used right now, right? Just one camera is being used, and an entirely different one from a remote location is being used. So if you go kind of the external route where you've got somebody appearing remotely, you need to rethink that. And now you're really thinking about recording softwares and how you're gonna organize that.
Yeah. So just for those who are like, oh man, I don't want to build a studio. I don't want to, buy a soundboard. I don't want to do all of that. I just want to host a podcast. How do I just host a podcast out of the box? So I will tell you what I use. And I don't have all the equipment we have in the office, but I do have some high-end equipment that I do use to be able to appear remotely. So the first thing is a very high-end Sony camera. I think it's like a ZV something camera, but if you Google it, you'll find it. And there's some programming that you have to do with the camera to make it so that it does a USB stream. But I use that. I connect that to my computer using a Thunderbolt cable, a 10-foot Thunderbolt cable. I put that on a tripod. For my microphone, I use the same that we have in the office, a high end, I think it's Sheer or something like that. And then it has I'll pull it up. It has like a little tripod that folds up nicely, and you can put in a bag that you can then set out on a desk. I have a Focusrite converter from XLR, because we use XLR mics, but it converts it from the XLR to USB. So that plugs into the computer by USB. And then I have these headphones. They're high quality headphones that we use. I think it's the same. It's a little different headphone, but it's the same company that makes mine as the ones you have on there. And then and this what Andy said is very accurate. Lighting's critical. So I have a big ring light that's behind my camera, directly behind it, and that's really what I use for this office, because it's not huge. That's enough. When if I ever shoot from my home office, which I have in the past, I have multiple ring lights, some portable LED lights that I use for that. But basically, you need a ring light, you need a high quality camera, high quality microphone, a tripod, a Focusrite or some other XLR converter, set of nice headphones, and then I failed to mention the background. So it's basically a portable background. That sets up. It's I don't know, probably 7 foot by 4 foot that I basically set up and take down, and it fits in a bag that I basically traveled around the country with. And there's screws and different things you have to do to set it up. Most of the time it would fit, because ceilings are normally 8 foot. But you want to have a nice background. And your background should match, you want to brand it or match the whatever color scheme you've used to brand your show. And so that's what I use for this particular show is this background. I also use it for other things as well, but that's been huge. I mean, I couldn't imagine shooting the podcast out of hotel rooms where you get to see, beds and different things. And those virtual backgrounds are terrible where, you move your head this way and like you disappear. Like everyone's like, well, why don't you do something, legit or whatever? And so, this background's been huge for me and allowed me to basically be mobile. So, for a few $1,000, honestly, you could put together a pretty nice setup if it's just you doing the show.
Yeah. If there's one thing you can take away from any of this, virtual backgrounds need to die a quick death. I think they're terrible. The video look is not great. They're okay for a Zoom meeting, I guess, but if you're trying to produce something, it's much easier and to just have a clean background that you do. Let's talk about some softwares and kind of work through this real quick that are important to think about. There's a lot of different softwares that you can use. First one you need to be thinking about is how are you going to record and stream the podcast. So by stream, we mean since we do a live show, how can we broadcast out this live show to multiple different platforms? Our viewers right now are watching from Facebook, YouTube, X. It's going to a lot of different places. How do we do that? Well, we use a streaming software that also acts as a recording software. So it's broadcasting our live feed to all those channels simultaneously. It's recording our show at the same time. It's also recording the audio. We can take all of these things, download them, and then use those for the audio version of the podcast. So streaming and recording, the best software that we found that we like to use, free commercial for all these places, but it's Restream. That's what we use. It works pretty well. You pay a monthly fee depending on, how much you want to broadcast out. But boy, it seems like it's been just about the simplest way for us to do that. It's a cloud-based, internet-based program, and it's worked well for us. I know there's other ones on the market as well. I know, Sean, we haven't really tried them. Restream's worked well for us, but that is one area you want to think about. Hosting software. Keep in mind that if you're going to have a podcast, you need a software that hosts it and blasts it out to the different audio platforms. We use a program called Buzzsprout, but it holds the episodes and sends those out to those platforms at the appropriate times that you've set up. Editing software is also an important thing. If you're going to just do a live show and you're just going to stop there, well, okay, then you don't really need to think about anything else. The live show is going to sit where you've just sent them, and that is what it is. But if you want to create shorter videos out of that you can edit and do things to and broadcast those out on Facebook, on YouTube, or all the different platforms, you want to be thinking about editing software. There's a couple easy ones. There's a universe of editing softwares, from the highly complex that a video editor would use for high-end videos down to stuff that you can do on your iPad, like from iMovie to CapCut or these different things that allow you to pretty simply download long-form video, edit it. You can do it from an iPad. You can do it from a home computer. Not that difficult. There are also some really good AI softwares that can generate shorts. So content that's below a minute in time, that you'll see like on Reels on Instagram or on Facebook or Shorts on YouTube. There is good AI products that can quickly take long form video and turn that into small shorts. We use Opus Pro is the one we use as an AI software. There's others, all good options. And if you're not like super into video editing, if you're a lawyer or a different professional like us, then that's going to be something that might be handy for you. But you need to be thinking about all those different elements of the software side of things. Sean, have I missed anything when it comes to software?
art. I mean, we do have thumbnails. The thumbnails serve basically two purposes for us. So the first thumbnail purpose is to basically advertise or broadcast the episode. So, we have some art that goes out there with our announcement on social media and of the show and the upcoming show. And then second, we use that during the show because we can then put up the thumbnails while the intro or outro music is happening. Our very first episode, like we started and the music's playing and we didn't put the thumbnail up and we're sitting there looking at each other like, okay, this is interesting. What do we do? And it was very awkward. And I think even one of your kids commented like, what are you guys doing? Like, why'd you guys do it that way?
Kids are the best editors of YouTube videos.
Yeah.
I can tell you real quick if you're an idiot.
Yeah. And we were. I mean, we were like, okay, we got some music. Like, this is awkward. Like, and it went forever, it seemed. So we were like, oh, let's just put the thumbnail up and put the, while the music's playing. And so the thumbnail is there. We're not on camera. We can sit there and do whatever we want. It doesn't look awkward. And then when the music's done, the thumbnail comes down and we start the show. Those, you can really utilize a thumbnail in that way. Now we have a little video and then we put it up for the outro music. I think it's very important to have that for both promoting and use during the show.
Well, and even if you're just an audio podcast and you're thinking, well, I'm not worried about all that video stuff. Have you ever seen an audio podcast that does not have a thumbnail associated with it on iTunes or Spotify?
Right.
No, there's always a show thumbnail that at a minimum you need to create. So you got to be thinking about art. And there's obviously there's, tons of different products that you can use to create all that. So we don't have too much more time, Sean, but I did want to give the viewers kind of a rundown of what our process is in preparing for a podcast, so they kind of know what kind of time it takes, and then just go into, and we can mention, I think what probably is easily the most time consuming thing, which is arranging guests. And we're fortunate to have good help with our producer that helps with a lot of that. That would probably make life a lot more difficult for Sean and I and make, the lift much more difficult, but something you need to be aware of in going into it. But let's talk about how we plan for this. What do you think, Sean? We plan out every season about every 3 months or so. Is that about right?
Yeah. Every 3 months or so, we have a meeting and we basically plan out a season, which I think is, a 3-month time period where we basically 3 or 4 month time period where we basically go and say, okay, let's do an episode on this. This would be a good guest. And we come up with our, show themes, titles, and guests for the show. And we basically lay out the season. And like you said, we have Rodlin behind the scenes who's tracking down the guests, getting them to, come on. We have like a media release that they sign. She gets that for us. We basically, we plan it with her, but then she kind of really does the work behind the scenes that makes it even possible for the show to go forward.
Yeah. So once we have a season planned out, then we've got, we do a weekly show. Let's talk about what we do to prepare for that weekly show. So Sean and I meet, we do a Tuesday show. It's today, Tuesday, every Tuesday at 10 a.m. We meet the Friday beforehand. We've already, because we planned out the season, we know the show coming, we know the guest. We've confirmed the guest at that point. We meet for, at a minimum of an hour every Friday, outlining exactly what the topic's going to look like, preparing, just kind of the general flow of the discussion. We meet to post the thumbnails that we just talked about, scheduling the next next episode, giving the description in Restream, which is then going to publish that out to everything. So usually every Friday before the show, we're going to go into detail in planning that out. I think one thing that's worth noting, it's always good to have a plan B, because sometimes your guest isn't going to come. And that's really problematic if your guest is the only one in the room with any expertise to talk about the topic that you were going to discuss. Sometimes that happens. So having maybe some sort of a game plan as to what else you might discuss in the event that happens. And that happens sometimes right at the last second, right?
Yeah. So we're fortunate that both of us are experienced in the real estate investor space, and we know real estate law, business law, estate planning, those types of things. So, we've had a number of times where right before the show, the guest had an emergency, or they just flat out said, "No, I'm not coming on," even though they confirmed, did everything, signed everything, they were ready to go, and they're like, "Nah, I'm not going to come on anymore." It's like, oh, okay, well, okay, what are we going to do? And we just throw out a topic and get moving on it and start, talking about it. And we've been fortunate, but we've always been able to come up with that plan B, and the show goes on, and we've made it go on. But yeah, it's important to kind of have, and for purposes of planning the seasons, you and I always try to have one or two topics where it's just the two of us. Like this is one, it's just the two of us. And I think it's important to have at least one, sometimes two or three. That way, if a guest doesn't show up, it's like, okay, well, in 3 weeks, we're going to talk about this anyway. Let's just bump it up. Let's do a quick outline. Let's just talk about that. And so it's always nice to have that in your hip pocket. And so I think it is important to have a couple of 2 or 3 shows scheduled where we have no guests.
Yeah, one thing just to add here as we come to a close, and you mentioned it, a couple of legal things to think about too. When you are broadcasting stuff out to the public, even for the possibility of a commercial purpose, I mean, at the end of the day, that's almost always for some sort of a commercial purpose. You are talking about potentially using things that belong to other people. Music would be one of those things. Make sure you have the proper licensing to be able to do that. But the other one that Sean mentioned was guest releases. Remember, you're bringing on guests that have been kind in coming on. What you want to do is don't make assumptions. We know what it means to make assumptions. Be clear on the front end who owns the content and who has the right to distribute that content. And what we found is we were fortunate to be thinking about this early on, put together a good guest release that just clarifies who owns the content. So there are no questions. And, I don't think we've ever had any sort of pushback. Oh, you got a release? Well, forget that. We're not coming on. Everybody understands usually who this belongs to because it's your show, so on and so forth. But that's something that should be on the forefront as you think about this. That there is no misunderstanding as to who owns the content that you're creating. Sean, we've hit just about all of it. Is there anything else you want to leave our listeners with?
No, I would encourage you. I mean, this is a lot of information. It probably is like drinking out of a fire hydrant for somebody that's wanting to do a show, but it's not as complicated as maybe it seems. I mean, you with some investment into some equipment, you don't need a podcast studio, that type of thing, but investment into some equipment and some ability to basically regularly schedule the shows, the guests, things like that. You can put together a good, podcast, a good show, and don't be afraid to do it. That's the thing. Like you and I had talked about it for years, and then finally we're like, we're just going to do it. And our first couple of episodes were horrible. And sometimes they're still bad after we've been doing it for a couple of years. But, unless you take that step, you're never going to do it. Unless you just go and shoot an episode, you're never going to do it. So just start. Yeah,
just do it. With that, thanks so much for being with us. Make sure to be with us this afternoon on The Collective at 2:00 p.m. Arizona time. And we'll see you next Tuesday. Thanks so much.
Have a good day, everyone.